So for our panel session today about labor and the Green New Deal, I really just want to emphasize that I think it's a really especially important topic given how governments are using the COVID pandemic as an excuse to ignore or roll back previous commitments on the climate, especially on stricken industries with really high emissions. So I think that broader discussions on how workers in the world can do more on tackling climate change are more necessary than ever. The Green New Deal has certainly been one such proposal for transformative and sustainable change. And I think it's really captured the attention of the wider public, scientists, and activists alike. Over the past few years, we've seen Green New Deal packages to cut greenhouse gas emissions, repair the global economy, and put countries back on track to tackle their inequality problems. So for today's panel discussion, I want to talk about, is a green recovery actually off the agenda? Are workers and unions likely to support a Green New Deal with millions now unemployed? What is the appetite for workers and citizens taking on big oil? And are unions ready to take up the fight for a clean, zero carbon economy? These are all questions that we'd like to discuss today. And joining us on the panel today, I'd like to welcome John Calvert, who's an associate professor in health sciences at Simon Fraser University, and a longtime environmental researcher. Lara Skinner, who's the executive director of the ILR Worker Institute in New York City. Joie Warnock, formerly the Western Regional Director for UNIFOR, Canada's largest private sector, now working as an assistant to UNIFOR's president, Jerry Diaz, as well as Mike Williams up in Maine, who's the Deputy Director of Blue-Green Alliance. It's great to welcome all of you today. So I want to start with the COVID pandemic and a green recovery. There's been a recent report by the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and they report that governments are planning to spend trillions on rebooting their economies. But almost all of the spending comes with no conditions, and only a comparative minuscule 12 billion is supposed to go towards low carbon industries. Mike, I'd like to start with you today. It seems that the #1 priority of government officials is simply to restore the economy and bring back financial markets as fast as they can. Do you think that the COVID crisis means the end to any hope of decarbonizing the way we work and run our economies?
No, and it hopefully means an end to the unfair and polluting ways in which we've been running our economies for decades. I think so. In the US, the spending on recovery hasn't started yet. We've been focused on relief and dealing with the direct fallout of COVID-19 and what it's done to the workforce and what it's done to just human beings. So that spending to actually dig us out of the depression effectively that we're in, it hasn't happened yet. And so I think, but to that point of me pushing back on the question and answering in a positive fashion, I think there's a couple reasons why. I think there's actually, this is by no means an end to the hope that we'll actually be able to fully decarbonize our economy and change our economy to be a more equitable, just operating system for all people. And couple of those reasons. One, people are finally seeing working people as being essential, whether they're grocery store workers, nurses, teachers, firefighters, so on, so people in manufacturing facilities. All of a sudden they are essential workers, and we're seeing just exactly how important they are. All the parents across the country cared about their teachers, but my word, they really see how important childcare is right now. And it's also lifting a veil on the fact that all these working people who we are deeming essential, and they are, and they always have been, we're realizing just how poorly we've treated them. In the US, I'm speaking for the US. They don't have proper wages, proper benefits. Oftentimes they're pushed back on if they try to organize. So I think this has really shown a light, and we can see that in public opinion polls that unionization for these folks is becoming much more popular. Ensuring that people are paid well, have proper health and safety efforts, that's become much more popular and much more evident. So I think there's a big chance and opportunity coming out of this that we're actually going to treat people better. The next one is we're seeing the importance and benefit of localized manufacturing, domestic manufacturing, or at least continental manufacturing, North American manufacturing, because America lurched into this crisis. One, our federal government was completely ill-equipped, but also noting that we did not have the proper protective equipment here, and we were relying on it being shipped from overseas. And it's that reliance on a globalized economy that could not meet the needs in a crisis that is showing the importance of having a local manufacturing base. And that's incredibly important if we want to have a just economy and have a strong middle class. And the final piece I guess final two pieces. One, on pollution. I think this COVID crisis has given us a window into what our world could be from an environmental perspective. The example being Los Angeles. I don't know if any of you saw that picture of Los Angeles a couple weeks after it shut down. It was crystal clear. Los Angeles without smog. Why? And people are sitting there going, why can't that be every day? And so I think people in America are going to come out of this saying, why should we have to go back to what that was? And that gets to the final point, that I think this is something where we're going to start launching into the recovery period, and people are really focused on building back better, or building back in a much different, fairer way. And there's a couple explicit examples that have just come out in the last few days. The biggest one in the House of Representatives in the United States, a bill, HR number 2. It's a big comprehensive infrastructure package that the House Democrats have put forward, and they're going to move next week to pass. It'll pass through the House and it will fail in the Senate. No bones about that, that our government, federal government, is dysfunctional to the hilt, which I'm sure everybody here understands. But it's laying the groundwork so that when we hopefully get a better, more functional government, that we will be able to build it back in a much better, cleaner way that actually addresses economic inequality, that addresses injustice, both racial injustice and economic injustice, and then deals with the climate crisis. And Vice President Biden, who is the Democratic Party's candidate for president, his infrastructure plan and his statements on getting out of the COVID crisis and recovering loops in climate change into all of it. So that's my long answer to say, no, that there's hope, and we, I don't know, I feel hopeful about it.
John, well, thanks, Mike. I think there's, if you couldn't come up to Canada and run for the Green Party anytime, I'll vote for you anytime. So I'd be great. But John, I'm wondering, do you think there's the same sort of groundswell of public support for a Green New Deal? And I ask this because here in Canada, it seems like, well, I haven't seen Elizabeth May for 3 or 4 months, but I certainly have seen the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers talking every day about how they need billions more for relief. I also see they've submitted their regulatory rule wishback list to every government minister, provincial and federal. And it seems that the feds have already done everything they possibly can to take over orphan well cleanup. I'm wondering if all this is happening for business and they seem ever more aggressive and ever more successful, is any discussion of a green economy here in Canada now off the agenda, despite some of the positive things that Mike has pointed out?
John, you ask a difficult but perceptive question here, and one that is challenging to everybody, I think, in terms of coming up with the answers that really will move us forward. I mean, there's no question that the fossil fuel industry in Canada, as is true globally, is hugely powerful and has a kind of toxic impact in terms of our politics as well. And that goes back historically for a long time in Canada, but one can see, as you point out, that the fossil fuel industry has its agenda now. And that part of that agenda, of course, is rolling back the environmental gains and some of the admittedly very limited steps that we've taken to try and address some of the more obvious consequences of climate change. And also, again, as you rightly say, the industry has seen this as an opportunity for it to make some gains in terms of pushing not only for the subsidies and tax cuts and so on, but also for the pipelines that are part of its wish list and for the rollback of a whole range of environmental regulations, which we're now seeing in Alberta, for example. And they have a government there that's very sympathetic to their financial interests. And part of their pitch to the public is essentially just give us lots more money and the good times will come back. That's the, the jobs that we used to have 10, 15, 20 years ago, they'll all reemerge again if you just give us what we want. But first, for a lot of workers, the good times weren't really so good anyway. There was always a boom and bust, and the bust part was mainly how workers were victimized by the way in which the economy, the oil industry particularly, functions. And frankly, there isn't any opportunity, I think, that the good times are going to come back now for a whole range of reasons. We know what's happened to the global oil industry and the price of oil how it's plummeted and has remained low and will continue to remain low for, I think, indefinitely into the future. We're not going to see the kind of price increases that would enable the industry to go back to what it was doing 10 or 15 years ago in terms of investment. That's just not going to happen. But the other part of that is what's happening on the jobs front. And the oil industry has never been a huge creator of jobs. I mean, they've always maximized the multiplier effect of what they've been investing. But in terms of the total number of jobs created, 63,000 nationally. And even if you do a multiplier on that of 2 to 3, you're not looking at even as much as 1% of total employment in Canada. So if you're looking to the fossil fuel industry to provide the jobs that people are going to need, because there is, as is the case in many developed countries now, skyrocketing unemployment, that's not going to happen. In terms of the Alberta oil sands, to get one job, it takes, historically in the last year or two, $1.3 million of investment, which is a huge amount of money for a single job. And the industry has been restructuring. It's much more capital intensive. It went through this period when it was basically a construction phase of the oil sands. And that's coming to an end now. We're into the operational phase. And the operational phase is one where they don't need that many workers. And so those kinds of jobs certainly are not going to return to Alberta. The industry's pitched that the good times are coming back. That's not going to happen. So even though the narrative that the industry has got and its lobbying power and its ability in part to shape people's perception of what's needed is still there, the reality is it's not going to be able to deliver. So in terms of labor, the fossil fuel industry does not have the jobs that people need. Now, there are jobs that can be created, and I think what Mike was saying earlier is identifying some of the key areas. The expansion of employment, particularly in areas where I do my research, namely construction, has huge possibilities in terms of retrofitting our whole building sector, our built environment. There's a possibility of a major job creation initiative there, which also could create good jobs, could deal with issues around employment equity, and deal with the need for training in the industry as well, which is very important. So the possibilities are there in terms of meeting climate change objectives, but also meeting employment objectives, if both the union movement and more generally people in Canada have the ability politically to push government in that direction. And I just saw an IEA, International Energy Agency report last week that just came out about job creation. And although it's global in terms of its focus, so the numbers may be a bit high for Canada, but it's saying that retrofitting existing buildings creates between 9 and 30 jobs for every $1 million of investment. Now, even if we say that's a bit of a high estimate, it's still indicating the huge potential for employment creation in that sector and for dealing with the transition that the construction industry will need to make in Canada, particularly in Western Canada, from the focus on the oil and gas industry and big mega projects into doing environmentally responsible retrofitting of our entire building sector, which is what needs to be done now. Huge numbers of jobs potentially there. So that's the opportunity. How successful will be, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but the evidence is there that that's what needs to be done. If we have some time later on, I'd like to talk a bit more about what government should be doing in that regard as well. But that's what I see as being the possibility of dealing with this crisis that the fossil fuel industry has left us in.
Great, thanks so much, John. Lara, I just want to turn to you. I mean, John makes a couple of really good points that there's a really strong economic case to be made for moving towards a green economy and a zero carbon economy. And at the same time, he also notes that really it looks like the oil and gas industry is sort of flailing on its last legs and trying its best to sort of pump as much dirty oil for its $1 million profits, rather than actually trying to think long term. But I guess if there's an economic case to be made for a green transition, it seems like certainly in the United States, which is the biggest user of oil and gas in the world, that American government isn't going to be moving too quickly on climate change. And in fact, it seems like, especially both at the federal and at the state level, most of the governments are actually now focused on this idea of restarting their economy. I'm wondering, do you think that there still is a way of sort of building that political will in order to push for a green recovery and actually win a Green New Deal?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, what I would say, you know, I feel here in the US, we're sort of at a moment of great peril and great possibility. That's a very sort of volatile political moment. On the optimistic side, I think, you know, both the COVID-19 crisis and the current racial justice uprisings really highlight how broken our political economic system is. It's broken for workers, it's broken for the climate and the environment. It's especially broken for Black Americans, immigrants, and other people of color. So I think that all really sort of begs the question, you know, are we going to double down on a neoliberal market-driven economy that's based on racism, exclusion, and worker and environmental exploitation? Or are we going to shift dramatically? And are we going to try to build a more inclusive, equitable, fair, and ecologically sustainable economy and society? And that's really the question. And I think many unions are seeing that we're currently in a movement moment. You know, a social movement moment, that there's this wave of social movement energy in the US right now, and unions in the US have always been at their strongest. They've always been able to organize the most workers when they are able to join and tap into that movement energy. And I've been really encouraged by the powerful statements on white supremacy and racial justice that have come out of a number of US unions, like the Painters Union, like the Minneapolis Central Labor Council, the Amalgamated Transit Union, the Communication Workers of America, just to name a few of them. And I really say this because I think more and more US unions are recognizing the social movement energy, especially among young people and young people of color who are leading the fight against climate change and for climate justice, and really see an intersection between these battles around economic, racial, and climate justice. For them, it's, you know, so intertwined. And so I think there's no doubt that the US labor movement is unified in their calls for a major federal stimulus in response to this economic crisis that's been caused by COVID-19. I think unions are very aware that the 2008 recovery, we've basically still been trying to recover from it. We're still seeing wage stagnation from that crisis. And the economy here is not just going to snap back, right? We're going to need ambitious investments and reforms on a scale that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. So I think there's a major opportunity to push for that stimulus and push that a major chunk of the stimulus be spent on work to tackle the climate crisis. There's a collection of unions in New York who are pushing for a major climate jobs initiative that will help tackle the climate crisis and put people back to work coming out of this COVID-19 economic crisis. Their plans include making 2020 to 2030 the retrofit decade, the decade of retrofits. And basically, you know, where we should be requiring energy efficiency and solar power retrofits on every institution that's receiving state funds, including education, local government, and healthcare institutions, and doing major solar and energy efficiency retrofit work in New York State's public schools and universities. So it's just one example of a place that we could start where we would really link sort of our efforts to tackle the climate crisis, but also respond to this economic crisis and put people back to work. Of course, you know, these stimulus funds and these initiatives would have to be accompanied by strong labor standards and, you know, the typical stuff that we need to see in the US to make sure that they're going to be high quality jobs that would tackle the crisis of inequality. So that's prevailing wage, project labor agreements, labor peace and neutrality. The unions in New York are also exploring, what if we convene a wage board? You know, again, too many high wage jobs were replaced by low wage jobs coming out of the 2008 recession. New York State has the ability to convene a wage board. We did it for the fast food industry. That's how we set the $15 an hour wage for the fast food industry. What if we do that for the emerging clean energy sector? Right? We can't have this transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy undermine good union, high quality jobs. And so setting a wage standard for the whole industry would be one way to deal with both the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality as you invest these funds into new low carbon sectors.
Well, let me just stop you there and let me just jump off on that point, because I'd like to follow up more about the New York jobs climate. initiative that you've been involved in, but I'd also like to talk a little bit with others here about some of the initiatives that they've been involved with. Because just over the past few years, as Lara mentioned, there's been major initiatives take place with new union resolutions, union conferences, discussion initiatives, as well as new education about the climate crisis. We've certainly seen some unions in both Canada and the United States begin to push collective bargaining issues, whether it's an energy efficiency or an energy transition to a clean economy. And others, I think, have really sort of begun to push, whether it's the USW or now UNIFOR, for green jobs that are looking to protect the climate, but also secure a just transition that protects workers' livelihoods and well-being from the negative side effects of climate protection initiatives. Joie, let me start with you on this question. UNIFOR, I understand, has just launched a new campaign for a fair and resilient recovery called Build Back Better. I'm wondering if you can tell me a bit more about this and also talk about how UNIFOR has so quickly turned to a green jobs agenda.
Thanks so much, John. So I'm going to touch on our path to the Green Jobs proposal that we have launched this week. It's not our first foray into a green agenda. And our union and our members have a strong history with our commitment to sustainable jobs and the sustainable economy. We represent members in 22 sectors of the economy, including the energy sector. We have 12,000 members who work right across every aspect of this sector, and they're good jobs. They're proud of the work they do. But I want to situate this current work in some of our histories to bring some context. And in fact, we've been working along this path for about 50 years now. In 1970, the first Earth Day, it was auto workers who brought attention to the heavy industrial pollution on the Great Lakes from both Detroit and Windsor. Workers came together in boats and met in the middle of the Detroit River and placed a wreath on the murky waters there. And that was a focus that really started to amplify the work we did over the next decade. So in the 80s, in Canada, we fought for the establishment of healthier workplaces, establishing a national workplace hazard communication standard that's known as WHMIS. So workers in every worksite can go and look and see what hazard materials are being used in their workplaces and have the proper occupational health and safety standards. In the 1990s, our union loudly rejected the notion that we can have either good jobs or a clean environment, but not both. And we insisted that the union movement's efforts to provide workers with decent jobs can be reconciled with the need to protect the environment. And it was our energy sector workers who coined the term just transition in 1994. And to quote Brian Kohler out of the energy sector, he now is on staff at the Global Union Industrial, the real choice is not jobs or the environment, it is both or neither. And we feel this really still holds true today. It was energy workers in our union that led the charge for Canada's ratification of the Kyoto Agreement in 2002. We called for its implementation through a national energy policy that included mandatory targets and requirements, embracing all sectors of the economy and just transition for any impacted workers. We've had in our culture a history of environment committees, environment workplace representatives that are negotiated into some of our collective agreements. Over the years, our members have participated in workshops, conferences, educationals on the environment, and this year marks 10 years of participation with Blue Green Canada. And more recently, we participated in 2 just transition task forces related to the phase out of coal power in Canada in Alberta in 2017 and a federal task force in 2018. Our members are impacted directly. So this path to decarbonization is through their livelihoods and through their lives and their communities. So we have a lot to say about the path to decarbonization. We've worked through all this time with our global union federations in support of the Paris Agreement, ILO's a decent work and sustainable jobs emphasis. We sit at the Trade Unions for Energy and Democracy table and on this very exciting North American Solidarity Project. We've participated at government tables. In Alberta, the Notley government led on the climate leadership plan, and we were instrumental, the trade unions were instrumental in getting some good just transition language into that climate leadership plan. There were a number of tables that were held during the Alberta Notley government's time in government in Alberta, and we've also participated in Clean BC's Climate Advisory Council. So there's a quick overview, the quick 50 years to turning to this green jobs agenda. And just ahead of this terrible pandemic, our energy, environment, and economy, what we call the UNIFOR E3 committee, was in the midst of a rollout of a series of town hall meetings where our members were going to be surveyed on their most pressing concerns around climate change and related structural changes in the economy and how it impacts their work, their communities, their lives. And as a means of developing a series of policy proposals, bargaining tools, potential actions around the climate and the environment. The COVID-19 crisis accelerated the policy piece. And as other panels have talked about, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been really, really serious, the terrible impacts on our members. We put together a task force that has been meeting almost daily. And as we were working to mitigate the terrible impacts, we also wanted to be forward-looking. Much of the work that we were doing was really picking up the pieces of what is so broken in our society, in our economy, a broken EI system in Canada, precarious work, poor treatment of what now are being called, our members now being called essential workers on the front lines of the pandemic. So we engaged in this good engagement with our members, their input into the final paper via a series of webinars. So we launched last week, and the green jobs and decarbonization proposals represent one of 5 planks we put forward as part of Build Back Better, this campaign, which is really an attempt to provide a comprehensive path forward for some of the most pressing policy initiatives that the labor movement has long been advocating for. For the list of proposals, the Build Back Better campaign includes proposals for improving income security programs, rebuilding Canada's infrastructure, both social infrastructure and physical infrastructure, revitalizing domestic industrial capacity, and holding corporations to account, particularly when it comes to support packages or bailouts. We launched on Wednesday. The website is buildbackbetter.unifor.org, and the plan is to use this project as a platform to spread awareness about how the current crisis provides us with an opportunity to rebuild Canada's economy in a more equitable and green direction, as well as push governments to think bigger on what might be accomplished during these unprecedented times. On the green jobs front, we have 8 proposals that target a wide range of areas that we think there are key opportunities to move us closer towards climate targets while providing the necessary support to help workers transition into new areas of work. So these areas include providing specific industries with targeted support programs backed by a just transition fund that would provide training, income support, and early retirement allowances to impacted workers, a national public transit strategy that would see increased federal support for green transit initiatives, support for zero emission vehicles manufacturing in Canada through a national automotive strategy that would attempt to attract investment and expand ZEV manufacturing capacity across the supply chain, developing a green jobs training system, and reorienting employment support systems and accreditation towards supporting green jobs and this transition to green jobs. To be clear, these proposals are not just aimed at government, but are meant to spark discussion both within our union, amongst our members, and in the broader labor movement as a whole about how we can support the move to a greener economy and meet our climate targets, while simultaneously protecting good jobs, particularly in the context of the current crisis where the green jobs agenda may have taken a backseat to much more immediate pressing economic concerns.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Joie. The Build Back Better sounds like a really promising initiative, and it's good to hear how much support there's going to be for it going forward from UNIFOR. Lara, I just want to take up that sort of issue about, promising initiatives. When we met last year, I have to say I was completely blown away by Climate Jobs New York, as well as how active the Workers Institute had been in getting this off the ground. Could you tell us a little bit about that and where you're able to get that coalition going? What was some of its early success? What were some of its early problems? And how is that sort of going forward today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what happened was Hurricane Sandy hit downstate New York and Hurricane Irene hit upstate New York. And that was in 2013, 2014. And New York and the surrounding area was really devastated by those climate-driven extreme weather events. And it resulted in a much higher level of consciousness around the climate crisis in New York. You know, it was suddenly not something of the future, but something that's here now and majorly impacting us. And so we really sort of saw that as an opportunity to convene unions to think about how they could really sort of play a major role in addressing the climate crisis and use it as an opportunity to create good union jobs. And so, you know, many of the union members in New York City were on the front lines of dealing with the climate crisis. They were nurses that were carrying patients downstairs when the elevators went out. They were, you know, AFSCME workers, public sector workers who were stranded at wastewater treatment plants when they were flooded. They were utility workers who were trying to get the power back online for people. They were transit workers who were trying to get buses and trains to safety from flooding. So that was happening. Union members were really on the front lines of the crisis, and working people were clearly hurt first and worst from that crisis. And it was working people, it was people of color, it was immigrants and women who had the fewest resources to really recover and adapt from the damages of those storms. And so we knew coming out of those hurricanes that there would be a lot of efforts and proposals to deal with the climate crisis and hopefully reduce the, you know, the impacts of climate change moving forward, reduce the number and frequency and intensity of storms. But we knew that a lot of those proposals probably would not address the needs and interest of working people and of the labor movement. And so we sort of said, what would it look like for us to convene labor and to help labor develop its own proposal to tackle the climate crisis and do it in a way that would build a more equitable economy, that would create good union jobs, that would try to build more equitable and resilient communities. And so we worked with the main labor federations in New York, the building and construction trades, the New York State AFL-CIO, the New York City Central Labor Council, and many individual affiliates, and said, let's convene a process and let's really go through the challenges that this transition presents for labor, but also the opportunities. And let's figure out how we can tackle those challenges, but also how we can seize the opportunities. And I won't lie, it wasn't a quick process. It was a 3-year-long process. But I think we made some important strategic decisions when we launched the process. One, we decided that it would be a labor-only process, that we really wanted to do this work within the House of Labor before we moved to trying a labor, environmental, or broader coalition. So that was one thing. The other thing was that we centered the process around building trades and energy unions. Some of the most active unions in the process were unions that were currently going through plants being shut down and dealing with their workers being displaced and how to handle that transition in real life in practical terms. That was the second thing. And then the third thing I would say is that we really sort of reframed our approach to the issue. We said, you know, most people are saying we've got a climate crisis, we've got this major environmental issue to deal with. And we said, hang on, we have 2 crises. We have a crisis of climate change and we have a crisis of inequality. And any solutions that we're developing have to be addressing both of those crises. And so that was kind of a major reframing that we did of this issue that I think has been really important to how we move the work forward. And so it was a 3-year process. It was a multidimensional research, policy development, training, and education process where we were convening regularly. The Cornell team was doing a lot of background research to understand what the climate crisis looked like in New York, what sectors would be impacted, what we needed to do to reduce our emissions according to science, and really figuring out where do we pair up and find that sweet spot of getting the most emissions reduction, the most high quality job creation, and the infrastructure investment that we need to build more equitable and resilient communities. And we came out with very concrete recommendations from that process. It was a 10-point recommendation plan for what we could do in the building sector, the energy sector, the transport sector. And so I think, you know, that was another piece that was made it a very successful effort, was that we had a very concrete agenda that we could move coming out of it. And at the end of that educational process, the unions that were involved said, this can't just be a good idea and a good report that we developed. We actually have to try to make this stuff happen. And as good trade unionists, we know we've got to run campaigns to implement these recommendations. And so that's what they did. They launched an organization called Climate Jobs New York. And they've been around since 2017 now. And they've had some great successes. Shortly after they launched, they were able to secure prevailing wage requirement on all large-scale renewable energy projects in the state. They were able to double the amount of money that's available for solar and energy efficiency retrofits in public schools and public buildings, all covered under a project labor agreement, which ensures the quality of the jobs. And then most recently, they've been spending a lot of time working on offshore wind. They helped to secure the most ambitious offshore wind target in the country in New York. New York is now committed to building 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. That's about half of New York's power. It's about $50 billion worth of work. It's about 1,000 turbines that will be put in the water. And all of that work will be covered by a project labor agreement as well. So that's been a huge victory, and it's very exciting to see Climate Jobs New York continue to push that work forward. They're now looking at how do they really sort of make New York and the East Coast sort of an epicenter for the offshore wind industry. It's great to have the construction work, to know that those are going to be good, high quality jobs covered under this project labor agreement. But we know that operating a coal, oil, or gas plant can take hundreds, if not thousands of workers. Once you have the solar and wind up, right, it doesn't take a lot of workers. And so securing the work around manufacturing, assembly, the ongoing operations and maintenance work connected to the offshore wind industry is incredibly important. So they continue to work at, how does New York really go big and bold on this and secure a whole industry around offshore wind? And I can talk more about it, but I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lara. And yeah, because it's interesting that you've talked about how important it was to reframe this sort of the debates and really bring labor in. And Mike, I understand that the Blue-Green Alliance has been doing something very similar with its Solidarity for Climate Action. And that, over the past few years, you've been really working hard to get unions on board. But now you're really trying to push this into the general public as well as into the political realm. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of Solidarity for Climate Action and what your goals are and what some of your successes have recently been with that?
Sure, yeah. And I totally hear you on long processes, Lara. Ours took quite a while. Although not fully 3 years, although I guess you could say it's taken 10 years. So coming out of the 2016 election in the United States, there was a lot of soul searching. A lot of people did a lot of soul searching, and we were among that. Basically, what we felt like we were confronted with was that our message was not being heard by working people. And also, probably much more poignantly, our message, we weren't speaking correctly to working people. And so we wanted to understand what was happening there. And so, long story short with that, we spent roughly 18 months doing a series of listening sessions in industrialized and deindustrializing areas across the country, mainly through the industrial heartland, everywhere from the Iron Range, Minnesota, to Northeast Ohio, Southwest Pennsylvania, West Virginia. We did one up here in Waterville, Maine, right outside of Paper Mill, and listened to people. And then we did a series of paid focus groups to throw some scientific element over it. And then we did a series of polling and message testing across the industrial heartland and Appalachia. And all of that was based on us trying to just ask questions of people, what they cared about in terms of the economy, about trade, about climate change, about the environment. And summing it all up, what came back to us was that people really, and this was all focused on working people, working class people. And then when we got into polling, we did, mainly swing voters. We sort of lopped off the hardcore on each side. But what we got back from all of that research and work we put in was that working people really give a hoot about solving climate change. They really care about clean air and clean water, but it can't subvert their basic economic existence. They have to have a livelihood. They have to have good jobs. And they think that this notion that they should choose between those two things is abhorrent and ridiculous, and it's foisted upon them by politicians and Wall Street financiers. That's what they said. That's what they think it is a ridiculous thing to ever have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. Joie, that may sound familiar. And it's effectively our founding tagline at the Blue Green Alliance by Leo Gerard, the former longtime president of the United Steelworkers. And so that was affirming. It's like, great. But here's the kicker. Then they said, this is ridiculous. We shouldn't have to choose. There should be a big, bold, comprehensive plan that gets at this idea. So, okay. And so this is in 2018. We got all this information back. And we took it to our board of directors, which are leaders of international unions and national environmental organizations in the United States. And they said, this is great information. Go do that. Figure out the plan. Work with all the staffs from all of our organizations and go figure that out. And so what that meant to us was, okay, let's see if we can really dig into some of the bigger, bolder ideas out there around decarbonizing our economy, around massively increasing unionization, around labor standards, around renewable energy technologies, and really just start to get into it a little bit more. And this took from that point on, that took 8 months and 21 different drafts. And we landed on what our Solidarity for Climate Action platform is, which is signed on by 14 organizations, 8 unions, 6 environmental organizations. So unions from the building and construction trades, the public sector, from manufacturing, and then 6 of the largest environmental organizations in the country all came together and signed on to this. And it's 3 parts effectively: a vision, and a vision that mirrors, similar to what Lara was saying, that we cannot distinguish between the 2 crises facing America of economic inequality and climate change. And at that time, I think we were blind to the fact that there's another crisis in America, and that's racism. And so we get at equity and issues around that, but we should have called that out earlier. But the second part then gets into some core principles around scientifically based emissions reductions, community resilience, repairing our economy and our infrastructure, high quality job creation, and equity for marginalized communities, and a number of other pieces. And then the third part is getting into an actual policy outline. And this is where a lot of our debate happened. But we came to agreement on some actual forward-thinking efforts, some of the strongest stances by unions on climate policy in America. So calling for a decarbonization of the American economy by 2050, and meeting the urgency of the issue and getting solidly on that path by 2030, deploying massive amounts of clean and renewable technology, and so on and so forth on that realm. And then on the other side, getting our environmental organizations to stand up and call for mandated strong labor and workforce standards, adherence to collective bargaining agreements, allowing people to bargain on the job site, and making public policy changes so that it's available and easy to them, ensuring that we have expansion of domestic manufacturing in a clean, safe, and proper way. And so I think people, what we heard from working people is that they were hungry for a big, bold, comprehensive plan. And then what we got back from elected officials and this supposedly key stakeholder folk, they were hungry for a comprehensive plan that actually has buy-in from working people, from unions, from environmental organizations, so that we can get beyond fights of the past and really laser in on where we agree in an actual progressive, forward-thinking, solutions-oriented way. And so that was the focus of this effort. And we're now trying to take this out in addition to our work in the federal government, but using it also in work in a number of states. This is an example. It literally just came through on my email right now. I don't know if folks have followed it, but in California, they just passed one of the most, if not the most ambitious standards for trucking in the country. There now is a mandate of a percentage of trucks in California will have to be electric. And this was a joint effort. We worked with the Teamsters, the electrical workers, as well as the environmental movement in California to get this piece passed through the Air Resources Board. But because it also incorporates significant efforts to ensure that workers' voices are part of the development of this, that this is going to be a safer and healthier way for the trucking industry to operate, and that the electricity generation and such, or the electricity needs, would be met. So it's a really good effort to show and an example of how this comes to fruition.
I think you make a couple of really valuable points about how our political horizons have been widened. But Joie, let me ask you this. I mean, your UNIFOR has both oil and gas workers, but it also has workers in the auto sector who could probably see some sort of future coming out of this. What about those oil and gas workers, and what kinds of conversations are you having with inside of UNIFOR? I could see those oil and gas workers being pretty upset about the idea that the Build Back Better approach isn't going to provide some sort of support for those who are in oil and gas. How's UNIFOR trying to deal with those kinds of internal disputes and internal differences of opinion?
Well, I think it's important to really listen carefully to what unions, especially in Alberta, where a majority of oil production is taking place, and the leadership role that unions have played, similar to the process that Mike spoke about. There was sort of a deep listening community exercise called Narratives Alberta that the Pembina Institute held in communities across Alberta. And in situations where there is polarization, it really is easy to misunderstand what each other is saying. So I'm really heartened to see the good examples that Mike and Laura have emphasized. And for our members, the concerns and questions are, okay, so what are the new jobs and how do we get from here to there? And what does this mean, you know, for my job, my family, my communities? And we're talking about job to job just transition. And so some of the work that we did nationally on the coal transition task force, it was limited to coal. It was across a number of provinces, but the principles that were stated, it was a multi-stakeholder process, I think are really worthwhile having a close look at it. It is respect for the workers and their communities and ensuring that worker involvement is part of the process, that it leads to much better policy decisions and better outcomes. Alberta unions are the progressive partners in pointing the way and leading the way, including the Insulators Union. A shout out to the president of the AFL, Gil McGowan, who has just been a powerhouse on speaking on behalf of members in the energy sector and all across about, you know, how the transformation has begun and kind of how governments need to respond. So that said, there is this huge opportunity. John, Calvert, you've highlighted it, and it's going to take political mobilizing. So there's a federal Liberal government commitment to just transition legislation. There are some interesting proposals around companies having to address climate initiatives for any sort of bailout money. And in British Columbia, there's very interesting centering of climate commitments of Indigenous communities and tackling inequity in any sort of stimulus response. So I'm very heartened. Our members work together. We've been dealing with these issues. We deal with difficult issues. And I think what's at the heart of it is respect for workers in their communities, echoing as a guiding principle and in the recommendations to support that transition to a decarbonized economy.
Thanks, Joie.
Thanks.
One of the things that I think both you and John have mentioned is that how this crisis has sort of opened up a whole sort of other range of issues that, you know, involve work and involve labor and involve the sort of issues about what kinds of society we want, what kinds of labor market, what kind of work do we want. And certainly what we've seen just recently with the major protests about racial injustice in the United States is that we also have to think about how to create a much more fair economy. A couple of you have already mentioned about how, you know, a green recovery or a green plan could help us towards racial equality. Lara, I wanted to ask you, is there ways that you're thinking about the the green jobs agenda inside of New York? Can it also come together with a health agenda and with a racial equality agenda? What are some of the ways that could actually be operationalized and actually put into a real world effect?
That's a great question, John. And I think, yes, I think it can be, and I think it has to. As I mentioned earlier, you know, I think the COVID-19 crisis and the current racial justice uprisings really they really expose how broken our current political economic system is for workers, for Black Americans, for immigrants, for Indigenous people, for other people of color. And I think these crises they're both highlighting and deepening the dangerous levels of inequality that currently exist in the US. And I think, as many of you know, the climate crisis is a major public health and economic crisis that's being layered on top of the crisis of inequality that we already face. And it's the most vulnerable in our society. And we saw this with Hurricane Sandy and Irene. It's the most vulnerable in our society: women, immigrants, people of color, communities of color, low-income families that are hurt first and worst by climate change. And they're typically those who have contributed least to causing the climate crisis. So, even with the COVID-19 crisis, you probably all have seen the preliminary research showing that individuals who have been exposed to elevated levels of pollution are more susceptible to contracting COVID-19. And we know that climate change pollution is highest in low-income communities of color that are located near power plants, major highways, diesel bus depots, other high carbon activities. And so as we think about how to tackle the climate crisis, create good, high quality jobs, and tackle the dangerously high levels of inequality that we have, and that's inequality of income, wealth, power, race, opportunity, I think we have some really good opportunities, many of which the climate justice movement has been pointing out for many years to focus on. And, a couple that I would highlight are massively improving and expanding public transit. That's a major solution to dealing with the climate crisis. We have to get folks out of their cars and using public transit more, and that means making public transit very attractive, very efficient, very high quality. We also have to convert from, fossil fuel combustion cars to electric vehicles. And so I would just say on the public transit side, there's a range of benefits that come from us doing major public investment to improve and expand public transit. Many low-income communities and people without cars, they need high-quality public transit to get to work, to be able to access jobs, and to be able to get to other essential services. So expanding the public transit system not only reduces emissions, it also helps build more equitable communities and giving people access to jobs and to being able to live their lives in a way that they need to. It also reduces pollution levels in communities. Again, like I said, diesel bus depots, major highways in communities are a major source of pollution for those communities. And then the last thing I would point out is that, public transit systems and the public sector in general typically employs higher proportions of women and people of color. So again, investments in those sectors, is typically driving investment into those communities. So that's really important. I mean, a number of us on the panel today have talked about building energy efficiency and the need for retrofits. As John mentioned, that work is very labor intensive. I think, driving a lot of money into making our current buildings more efficient is going to be really important. And we should start with low-income families. Start with low-income families' houses and apartment buildings. Start with public housing. Start with public schools. That's a way that we both bring down emissions, but also create a lot of good jobs in these communities. And the example of, schools, that's something that we've really worked on in New York. Let's do energy efficiency and solar retrofits to every public school building in New York that is suitable for solar power. And I think, there's a kind of nice confluence there of where putting solar panels and doing this work in a school provides a sort of living laboratory for the students and teachers there, right? Like now you have an opportunity to be teaching about climate change and renewable energy. You have it right there in front of you. Your school is now run off of solar power. Utility costs are the second highest cost for schools behind staffing. So again, by doing these solar and energy efficiency retrofits, you're lowering the cost that they're spending on utilities, and you're freeing up that money to be spent on other things like staffing in the school. And then of course, in New York, we now have that work covered under a project labor agreement. So, by investing in that work, you're also putting people to work in good jobs doing that solar and energy efficiency retrofits. So, the public transit, the building efficiency, starting with low-income families, public housing, public schools are, sort of two of my top examples that we kind of bring the agenda for racial and climate justice together. Of course, a lot of other key investments, massive scale up of solar and wind, clearly very important. Very important to reducing levels of pollution. And then, you know, finally, I would just say, you know, this is an opportunity for us to really sort of bring together and break and forge an unbreakable link between the fights for worker protections, for economic justice, racial justice, and climate justice. I think we absolutely have to do that. I think we're going to need that level of movement power to win at the scale that we need to win.
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of optimism in what you say, Lara, about how we can build a program that really draws workers in and really does deal with all these kinds of issues of inequality, whether gender inequality, racial inequality, and the nature of work and how we can actually improve it. Mike, there's a question that's come in, and I just wanted to ask about the other side of it, but still, I would think that there's a real risk for many workers, especially workers who are in fossil fuel areas or who in areas where you don't have the state support, or in states or in provinces in Canada where they're tied to coal or oil and gas. I'm wondering, you and Blue Green Alliance have certainly been putting some thought to this. What is the sort of policies, and how do you get people to think about what a just transition is? What kinds of supports can we actually have for people who become unemployed? Is it completely utopian that people are going to be retrained when they're 40 or 50 years old? What are your thoughts on this, Mike?
Sorry, there's some feedback there. It's one of the more critical questions that we've had to grapple with. It's this notion that we operate under this notion that we should never have to solve climate change on the backs of working people, that we should never have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. And that's true across the board, but there's complications and there's nuance, and there are places in the economy and in industries where there's going to be changes. And it's just a matter of, to what you were saying, John, it's the matter of how we deal with those changes. Do we just allow the market to deal with those changes like has happened with the coal industry in America? It has been a market-driven effort along with some environmental regulation, but heavily driven by the fact that natural gas prices have dropped like a rock and utilities have made market-driven decisions to shut down coal plants. And in America, we don't have a good safety net, if any safety net. We have a little bit of unemployment insurance, a little bit of training support, and handshake, nod, goodbye, if that. And it stinks, and workers get screwed. And it's something that, you know, working people in America, especially unions, they were promised a decent amount in the 80s and 90s around trade and globalization. We're going to sign these big trade deals. Hey, you know, some of these factories might move to a different country, but don't worry. We'll have trade adjustment assistance. You'll be taken care of. That didn't happen. That failed. And so now there's this complete distrust that when we say, don't worry, the fossil fuel industries, of which you have tens of thousands of members, of real human beings with real jobs and real families that they have to feed, don't worry. We'll make sure you're taken care of. They go, no, not this time. And they have every reason to feel that way. So you asked a question about particulars. There are ways we can deal with this directly. So there's the manner of actually making it a mandate that when facilities are closing, they have to have long lead times. They have to work directly with the unions. There has to be big funds that are put together that supports economic development in the community. There has to be a strong social safety net so that workers who lose their job, they have health care. Their retirement is protected, so their pensions aren't rated by financiers who are selling it or municipal governments who are deciding, we screwed up our budget, so we're going to gut your pensions. We have to protect against all of that. The biggest piece, though, is, I shouldn't say biggest because those are absolutely core to solving this problem. The additional piece to this, though, is that long-term economic development thinking. Where are these facilities? Where are these industries? Where are the people who work in those places? How do we invest in them right now so that we are prepared, so that the people in those industries aren't 45 and going, oh, I lost my job in a coal plant and I live in Southeast Ohio. I'm going to get retrained to do what exactly within 60 miles of my home? And there's just not much there. It's a harsh reality the way it is right now, and we have a massive effort that needs to be changed, that needs to be put forward. There is a document that's going to be put out, I think next week, It's the National Economic Transition Platform that we've worked with a number of organizations, community-based organizations in Appalachia and across the country, a number of unions, the steelworkers, the utility workers union. I can't share it yet. It's still going through final review, but it's going to lay out a lot of really concrete, good policy items that municipal and the federal government need to implement to deal with this. But in the long and short of it, we need a lot of funding, and we need a social safety net in America. And I've heard from Canadian friends that it isn't that great either, that workers are not treated that well in terms of that. But you know, you guys have healthcare. We're a few steps behind. But it needs to be a commitment that's there, and it needs to be a real commitment, not just words on a paper. At this point, and I'll stop because I'm babbling, but if you say the words just transition to unions in America who have energy sector workers, you get everything from an eye roll to an angry face. In my experience, there's a number of folks, and we work with the folks in Colorado who have a number of energy sector folks. They decided that they were going to adopt that phrase, and we worked hard with them to develop a whole office of just transition in the state that was tied to their climate policy. They created a whole operation on just transition and supporting energy sector workers, and then we're going to work with them hopefully to fund that effort. But generally speaking, in the words of the president of the United Mine Workers of America, they refer to just transition as nothing more than a fancy funeral. And it's because the reality has not been backed up enough. We have examples, and I could start to go through them, but New York has interesting examples with the nuclear plants there. 2 of them were saved up north. Indian Point, right next to where I grew up, that is getting closed, but there's an effort underway and a whole transition task force and everything that is labor as part of it. And Lara certainly knows more of it than I do. But there are examples across the country where this is starting to happen piecemeal, but it can't be piecemeal. This is so important and honestly expensive that it needs to be a big, comprehensive federal effort.
Right. We're almost out of time, so just some quick final questions, and you only get a minute each. So, Joie, I'm going to start off with you. Can you tell me in a minute what's UNIFOR's priorities now over the next year with Build Back Better?
It's to push for the kind of massive infrastructural investments that's both social and physical that we need to push for radical structural changes to meet those targets. And really what this pandemic has highlighted is the fact that if we don't get our act together in this relatively short window of 10 years or so, that window will close. So there isn't an option to not do what we need to do to really shift the narrative away from kind of the austerity agenda that is emerging in Canada as we're talking about what a green stimulus would look like. So we've got a lot of work to do. The next 6 months to a year, we're going to be using the Build Back Better campaign to do that work. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Joie. John, do you think, what kind of green shoots are you looking for that are going to give you a sense of optimism going forward?
Just have to turn on my mic here. Well, I think demand for major, very substantial public investment in addressing a whole range of social needs and also environmental issues. That's what's needed right now. And that may mean that governments have to borrow some money, but with interest rates at basically zero, and with these pressing environmental and social needs coming to light in a way that was not possible even 6 months ago, this is where we need to push governments to do. They should not be continue to be captured by this austerity agenda that they've had for so long. And this is how we can deal with the employment issue as well. The agenda is for good jobs, union jobs that are providing important and needed public services, whether that's being in health or whether that's education, whether it's in childcare. There's all these areas, public transit. This is where governments need now to make investments, and this is what we need to push.
Great, thanks, John. Lara, let me ask you. I know that you and the Workers Institute have a lot of ambition. What's the next steps for you and Climate Jobs New York?
Yeah, John, we're very excited. Building on the success we had in New York, a new labor organization has been launched that's called the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. And it's going to be supporting unions in other states and other US states to set up similar pro-worker, pro-union climate models and agendas. So we're really excited about that. And Cornell just did a poll in New York State of all residents, upstate, downstate, Democrats, Republicans, across the political spectrum. And some of the questions we asked were around climate change. And amidst the COVID-19 crisis, this is a month into the COVID-19 crisis, 75% of New Yorkers were saying that they supported greater action on climate change and the creation of good jobs in clean energy sectors. And I just think that's really hopeful, and we're seeing that more and more. People want to see greater action on climate change, particularly when it's connected to dealing with the crisis of inequality and creating good union jobs. And we've just been so heartened by the fact that unions in many other states, including Texas and Illinois and Maine and Connecticut, have been approaching us and saying, yes, we want to do this. We want to get ahead of this. We don't want to be reactive and responsive. We want to be positive and proactive in thinking through how we can develop an agenda that's going to tackle the climate crisis at the scale science demands, but do it in a way that's going to also tackle inequality, create good union jobs, and do the infrastructure investment that we need to build more resilient communities. And, you know, it's going to look different in every state. You know, but I just think it's so heartening that there's this appetite to really sort of develop these pro-worker, pro-union climate agendas in other states, and we look forward to reporting on how that work goes.
Great, thank you so much, Lara. Now we are out of time, but if anyone who'd like to know more, please feel free to follow up. And I'd just like to conclude very quickly to say thank you so much for joining us today, and I especially want to thank our panelists again. John Calvert, an associate professor in health sciences at Simon Fraser University. Lara Skinner, Executive Director of the ILR Worker Institute in New York City. Joie Warnock, Assistant to UNIFOR's President. Mike Williams, Deputy Director of Blue Green Alliance. It's been great talking to you all. Many thanks for your thoughtful and considered comments, and I'm looking forward to hear more positive things and looking forward to hearing more from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Bye.